3 terrifying cave exploration stories that will haunt you. I've always been fascinated by caves, the way they stretch deep into the earth, the silence, the darkness. There's something both serene and terrifying about being so far from the surface, completely surrounded by rock. But one cave exploration changed everything for me. It was supposed to be a routine trip. My friends and I were experienced cavers, and we planned a weekend to explore a new cave system we'd heard about. It was remote, not on any official maps, but that only added to the allure. We packed our gear, checked our supplies, and set off early in the morning. The entrance to the cave was narrow, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through. Inside, the walls were smooth and damp, the air thick with moisture. We set up a line of glow sticks to mark our path and began our descent. As we moved deeper, the tunnels became tighter, the air cooler, the silence absolute. Everything was going fine until we reached a narrow passage that dropped steeply into darkness. It was a tight squeeze, but we decided to go for it. One by one, we lowered ourselves down, the light from our headlamps barely piercing the darkness below. When it was my turn, I hesitated. Something about that passage didn't feel right, but I didn't want to be the one to chicken out. As I squeezed through the narrow opening, I felt the rock walls pressing against me, as if the cave itself was trying to hold me in place. I struggled to move, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I managed to drop down into the chamber below, but when I landed, I realized something was wrong. My headlamp flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I called out to my friends, but there was no answer. I fumbled for my backup light, my hands shaking, and when I finally got it on, I realized I was alone. The passage I had just come through was gone, sealed off by a wall of solid rock. Panic set in as I searched the walls, looking for any sign of an exit, but there was nothing, just cold, smooth stone. I screamed for help, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. I was trapped, deep underground, with no way out. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it, a faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder, closer, until I could make out the words. They were calling my name, taunting me, telling me I would never leave. And then I saw them, shadows moving in the darkness, crawling along the walls, closing in on me. I backed into a corner, trying to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows reached out for me, their touch cold and clammy. I don't know how long I was down there, lost in the dark, but eventually my friends found me. They said I was hysterical, raving about voices and shadows. But the worst part, they swore the passage had never been sealed. They found me in the same chamber we had all entered together, but to me, it felt like I had been trapped for days. We never spoke about what happened, and I haven't been in a cave since. But sometimes in the dead of night, I hear those whispers again, calling my name from the darkness. We found the cave by accident. My buddy Jake and I were hiking through the mountains when we stumbled across the entrance. Just a small hole in the ground, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. But something about it drew us in, like it was calling to us. Jake was always the adventurous type, so of course, he wanted to check it out. I was hesitant. Something about that hole gave me the creeps, but he convinced me. We had some basic caving gear with us, so we rigged up a rope and started our descent. The cave was unlike any I'd ever seen. The walls were rough, jagged, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. There were strange markings on the walls, like scratches or claw marks, and the temperature dropped with every step. After about an hour, we reached a massive chamber. It was huge, the ceiling lost in darkness above us. In the center of the chamber was a pit, perfectly round, with walls so smooth they looked like they had been carved by something or someone. We shined our lights down into the pit, but it seemed to go on forever, the light swallowed by the darkness below. Jake was fascinated. He wanted to explore further, maybe even climb down into the pit. But I wasn't so sure. There was something wrong with that place, something that made my skin crawl. I tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. Before I knew it, he was rigging up the rope again, ready to descend. I stood at the edge, watching him disappear into the darkness. The further down he went, the more uneasy I felt. I kept calling out to him, but after a while, he stopped responding. The rope went slack, and I panicked, thinking he had fallen. I started pulling it up, my heart racing. But when I reached the end, Jake was gone. There was no sign of him, no resistance, no weight on the rope, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I screamed his name over and over, my voice echoing through the chamber, but there was no response. My mind raced with possibilities. Had he fallen? Was he hurt? But deep down, I knew it was something worse. Panic set in, and I debated what to do. I was miles from civilization, deep underground, and my friend was gone. I didn't want to leave him, but I was terrified of that pit, of what might be lurking at the bottom waiting for me. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, until I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was Jake's voice, faint and distant, calling my name from deep within the pit. But something was wrong. The tone was off, too low, too distorted, as if it was being played on a broken record. It wasn't Jake, I knew that much. But whatever it was, it wanted me to think it was him. I grabbed the rope and ran, not looking back, not stopping until I was out of that cave and back in the sunlight. I told the authorities what happened, but they never found Jake. The search was called off after a few days, and they wrote it off as a tragic accident. But I know better. I know that whatever was down there took him, and sometimes in the dead of night, I hear his voice again, calling to me from the darkness, begging me to come back. The cave was known as the Screaming Maw among locals, a name that should have been enough to keep anyone away. But legends like that have a way of drawing in the curious and the foolish, and I guess I was both. I'd heard stories of strange sounds coming from deep within the cave, crying, screaming, voices that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. Most people thought it was just the wind or the echoes of distant animals, but I was determined to find out for myself. I gathered a small team of fellow explorers, all of us eager to see if the stories were true. We entered the cave at dawn, the light quickly swallowed by the darkness as we made our way deeper. The air was damp and heavy, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The first few hours were uneventful, just a typical cave exploration. But as we descended further, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, the walls seemed to close in, and a sense of dread settled over us like a thick fog. It wasn't long before we heard it, the first faint cry echoing through the tunnels. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakably human. We stopped, listening, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sounds seemed to come from all around us, as if the cave itself was alive and crying out in pain. As we ventured further, the cries grew louder, more frequent, and more desperate. They were pleading, begging for help, but there was something unnatural about them, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My companions were visibly shaken, but we pressed on, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear. We reached a large cavern, and the cries were deafening, echoing off the walls and filling our ears with a cacophony of despair. The sounds seemed to be coming from below, from a deep, narrow shaft in the center of the cavern. We peered down into the darkness, our lights barely penetrating the void. One of my companions, a man named Eric, decided to rappel down and investigate. We tried to talk him out of it, but he was determined. He strapped on his harness and began his descent, his light bobbing in the darkness as he went lower and lower. We waited in silence, the cries echoing around us, growing louder and more frantic. Then suddenly they stopped. The silence was absolute, and it was more terrifying than the screams. We called out to Eric, but there was no response. The only sound was the creaking of the rope as it swayed gently. Panic set in, and we quickly pulled the rope back up. But when it reached the top, it was severed, cleanly cut, as if by a blade. There was no sign of Eric, no sign of what had happened to him, just the darkness below and the memory of those terrible, inhuman cries. We fled the cave, abandoning our gear and our search for answers. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that cave, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear those cries, echoing in my mind, begging for help that will never come.